A very good afternoon, distinguished guests, speakers, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Faiza and I have the pleasure to be your MC today. Welcome to this afternoon's ISAS panel discussion on Pakistan in challenging times. It is my pleasure now to invite Ambassador Gopinath Pillai, Chairman of the Institute of South Asian Studies, NUS, and Ambassador at Large, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Singapore, to chair the session.
Thank you, Faiza. Today we have a very interesting topic and four illustrious speakers. A good recipe for an interesting, stimulating afternoon. Pakistan, in a geostrategic sense, is a very important country, gateway to Central Asia. The link between South and West Asia, and also the linkage to the Muslim world. But for whatever reason, since its independence, it has had continuous flow of problems. I think since independence, only the last 5 years, there has been the democratic transition of power. It has always been to a coup. So challenges are not new to Pakistan. But to discuss them, we need experts who understand. So I would not stand in the way of the speakers and you and invite them. I won't read out the details of their background and so on because it's all been provided. We save some time. I think the first speaker is Professor Riaz Hassan, who is a sociologist and an excellent scholar, who is now residing in Melbourne, now in transit in Singapore. Prof. Hassan, could I ask you to start the roll?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm an old-fashioned academic, so after 50 years, used to either giving courses which last 12 weeks, I speak for 45 minutes. So I would have to make a concession today to myself in deference to my speakers, because they were quite happy for me not to speak at all, and I threatened that I'll speak for 45 minutes. The topic given to me is really was challenging in the sense that I could pick and choose what I wanted to talk, and I decided to select certain topics over which I have some limited expertise, and that I'll just share them with you. The outline of the talk I've chosen was 6 topics: demography, the indicators of health and social and economic well-being, religion and religiosity, the voting trends, militancy and its victims, and I'm going to offer a new paradigm, a new way of looking at militancy in Pakistan and also in other countries. You can see the age pyramid of Pakistan's population as of last year. And it's a very typical pyramid, and I'll explain to you why I think it's important to look at population. And now if you just go forward 25, 30 years, Pakistan's population will look something like the next slide. Next one. So if you just look at the comparison of the two, the reason I have decided to begin my talk with that is that age structures have enormous sociological implications. Pakistan in 2050 and Pakistan in 2016 and 17 is very different in terms of age structure. It has, in the next 25, 30 years, there will be enormous implication of the changing age structure on the class mobility. But most importantly, only one point I can talk about this for much much longer, but there's going to be an accentuation of intergenerational conflict in the next 25 years. Because first time in Pakistani history, the age would become in such a way there would be 3 generations which would have substantial numbers: the young, the middle-aged, and the elderly. And it just so happens the people in the middle age tend to have majority of resources at their disposal. So the conflict is going to be between young, the middle age, and the elderly. Not only people as the age become more conservative, culturally, socially, and politically, but they also, particularly the middle generations, tend to have all the resources. I'll give you an example. In Australia, 70% of private wealth is, for example, held by people between 40 and 60. Now, basically what happens when the age pyramid like Pakistan's emerges, the younger generation, the middle generation becomes the gatekeeper for resources, for assets and resources for life chances. And I think the younger generation, middle generation, and older generation consequently tend to have much greater conflict. Now, how this conflict will play out in the context of Pakistan, I'm not sure. But there's one thing for sure, that there will be a greater accentuation of intergenerational, not intragenerational conflict as we have seen in Pakistan over the last 70 years. The next one is just to provide you with an overview of the economic, socio-economic and health indicators of Pakistani society. I think between 1990 and 2015, the latest year for which I could get the data, and I'm very grateful to Faisal who helped me with this, Pakistan seemed to have made general improvements. Now, the point I want to make, this doesn't look like a profile of a failing state. Things are getting better in each and every indicators that you're seeing. In particular, Pakistan has made very significant improvement in controlling maternal mortality, which means the position of women is probably has a lot to do with this. And secondly, I think perhaps the most dramatic shift has been improved sanitation facilities, in which Pakistan has done much better. Now, is Pakistan really the shining example in South Asia? Unfortunately not. In fact, Pakistan has not done as well as other members of the South Asian community, particularly India, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. In fact, the only indicators in which Pakistan seems to have done better than others is the two that I mentioned, and in particular in sanitation. So while Pakistan has done reasonably well in improving the life and health of its population, but it has been lagging behind other members of South Asian communities. Now, one of the very important points that comes up very often in discussion for Pakistan is religion. I think my impression is that when you talk to people, they think Pakistan is the jihad central and a religiously fanatical country. Now, over the last 25 years, I have spent quite a bit of time studying the architecture of religious consciousness in Muslim countries. In simple, the nature of religiosity. When people say they're Muslim, what do they mean? Now, it will take me a long time to explain to you, but I'm going to show you two indicators in my research. One is the orthodoxy of beliefs, how orthodox are Muslims in their beliefs, and the second that will follow is the ritual. But let me look at you're looking at the orthodoxy of the beliefs. Now, when it comes to, there are, if I'm not mistaken, there are 9 countries in my study. 9. The last one I've studied is India. No, Pakistan, you are absolutely right. If you thought Pakistan is a very orthodox, they certainly are. I mean, 76% of them are, they on my scales, they actually have the highest score in orthodoxy. And I think the counter thing, my research is working because the counter is Kazakhstan. They don't have any orthodoxy because they were, for much of their, for 70 years or so, they were a communist part of the USSR. And what is interesting is that Pakistan has really very orthodox scores, very high on orthodoxy scores. But if you combine the first 5 and 4, you will see that actually there are other countries, Malaysia, Egypt, which actually are more like Pakistan than Iran or India, Turkey, obviously, both in Singapore and India, I'm talking Muslim minorities. Now, what happens when you look at the practice? Because people believe, and then the second part of religious life is to practice the beliefs. When it comes to belief system, you have a slightly different profile, in fact, very significantly different profile. And Pakistanis actually don't seem to be doing that well when it comes to practice. But compared to Indonesia, Egypt, Malaysia, Pakistanis actually don't appear to be as ritualistic in expressing their faith as the other countries are. I think I would like to take I'd just like to make one passing comment. It is how wrong are some of the experts when they talk about Iran and Turkey. And you can see actually Iran is the only theocratic state in the Muslim world. And it probably has really, seven very similar, Turkey and Iran have very similar profile. What is also interesting in Indian Muslims, if you compare the Indians and Pakistani Muslims, actually Indian Muslims are far more what I call liberal than the Pakistani Muslims. I wanted to mention this because I was talking to my colleague in the Institute, and he said to me, Indian Muslims are becoming very fanatical, and I'm sure Pakistani Muslims are even more fanatical than the Indians are. And I'm actually working on this research project. The difference, if the Muslim are a majority country, Muslim majority countries and Muslim minority countries, the architecture of religious consciousness actually is very different. And again, I don't want to dwell on that. Now, the next part I want to talk about is how does religion influence people's political behavior or political choices? I mean, most of the time I hear from, I read and I hear from people that Pakistan is very, of course it's religious, but Pakistanis are also becoming very fanatical or very orthodox in terms of the voting pattern. And I'd just like to share with you the behavior of Pakistanis when it comes to voting. How does religion play out in the choices of political parties and political leaders? And unfortunately, you can't read, I can't read from there, and it's very difficult for you. But then the next slide will show you, it moves from left to right. Majority of the Pakistanis vote for centrist, center-right, and center-left parties. 95% of Pakistanis. And it's not only one election, there are several elections. It covers, I think, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 elections. So religion is important to Pakistanis, but when it comes to political choices, they do not vote for religious parties. Jamaat-e-Islami is probably the most organized party in Pakistan. is perhaps the longest long-standing and most organized party, but it never gets any more than 5% of the votes, and mostly in the cities. And if you put the only time when the Islamic parties actually managed to get 12% of the vote was during Musharraf, when they actually had combined themselves into a Muttahada Qawmi Mahaz. I think that's, I can't remember the exact name. Just to basically point out that religion does not play a role in making people vote for Islamic parties. And most Pakistanis vote for center-left, center-right, and leftist parties. In other words, they are vote for pluralistic, democratic culture, and not for a hegemonic Islamic culture by voting for Islamic parties. The next point I want to just highlight is one thing that I've been researching on, and it comes out that Pakistan is a terrorist central. Pakistan is ridden with terrorism. There are a number of people who actually have researched on this who are in this room, and so have I. Now, there is no question about that there is terrorism in Pakistan. And the next slide will show you what is happening what has happened over the last 15 years. The terrorist attack, both suicide attacks are roughly about 4% of all terrorist attacks, but they account for 36% of all fatalities. But in Pakistan, you can see there was a peak around about 2006 to 2011, and it has been since going down. Now, there are a number of reasons why this change has occurred. Again, something that we can actually talk about. But what I'd like to show you, one of the points that I often hear, that Pakistan state is implicit in terrorism. Now, it may not be international terrorism, but may be more international terrorism. And I have no doubt that there are probably political and strategic linkages between some radical organization and Pakistani state agencies. But I wanted to show you the casualty, just to look at the casualties of terrorist attacks over the same period that this graph covers. If you could show the next slide, please. Now, I'm not sure how easy it is for you to read, but I'd just like you to read the last set of figures. Altogether, there were 62,403 casualties of suicide, of terrorist attacks. The largest number of people killed were the terrorists. And the second largest number of people killed, not the second largest, but the civilians. But the third largest people killed was actually the security forces. Now, I'm not sure if the state is complicit in terrorism, why would there so many terrorists be killed? I mean, the largest number of people killed are terrorists, out of 62,000, 33,700 were terrorists. And 6,800, I mean, that's a horrendous number of security personnel who have died in fighting terrorism. Now, it's not to suggest that this gives you the answer of all the issues that you might want to talk about terrorism, but it does provide you how complex the situation is in Pakistan. So Pakistani state is fighting very successfully, losing a lot of security people, killing a lot of terrorists. Unfortunately, I think some of the so-called terrorists probably are the people who are the bystanders. I have been to areas where attacks have killed young children, and they were counted as terrorist victims. So one has to take these figures with a certain degree of caution. But the general trend is there, that if the state was complicit, then the profile of the casualties would be slightly different. Now, let me just get to my final point. I think terrorism, first of all, let me say, because religious renaissance, which is taking place in the Muslim world, is also conducive to supporting Islamist terrorism, Islamist militancy. The evidence I have presented, and I'll be happy to elaborate, shows that increasing religiosity, in fact, is correlated to support for for pluralistic and multi-party system, not only in Pakistan, but in a number of other countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, etc. Most Muslims, while they are becoming more attached to the faith, do not vote for Islamic parties. They are not members of militant groups. So why is then terrorism seems to be so prevalent in Muslim countries? And here's my take, that Islamic terrorism, the terrorism in Pakistan is not because people are becoming more religious, but terrorists are becoming more isolated because they're losing support among the people. So terrorism in Pakistan and in many other Muslim countries is increasing, not because of religiosity, but because the terrorist groups are feeling more isolated, becoming more secretive, more violent, in order to assert, in order to showcase their beliefs and what they stand for. So it is the isolation of the terrorist group which explains the violence of Islamic militancy, and not the Islamic, not the increased religiosity. And I think this challenge for this would be, for the Muslim countries, would be to actually have more open political cultures and more open political systems. The worst thing you can do is to actually ban terrorist organizations because they go underground and you don't know what they're doing. I could really go on for quite a bit, but what I've tried to do is to give you a snapshot of Pakistani society, both democracy, how it will impact on Pakistan in the next 25 years, the patterns of religiosity, the nature of militancy, and the causes of terrorism and the role of the state in countering terrorism. Thank you very much.
The next speaker is Dr. Iftekhar Chowdhury, a former foreign minister of Bangladesh, and he's going to talk about a very interesting subject, not that the others are less interesting, but the role of judiciary in Pakistan's constitutional development.
Thank you, Chairman. My friend and colleague of many years, Shahid has published his latest book. It's called An Era of Darkness. It's a robust nationalist polemic, and in it he's trenchantly criticized the British Empire in India. Shashi has called the British rule the greatest crime in all history. And Shashi, of course, is an honorable man. But I shan't be making my pitch unnecessarily Shakespearean. But might I just point out that in any objective analysis of this period, there would be occasion to discern small mercies. And one side is the idea of the rule of law. There would have been, of course, a sense of justice among the ancient and medieval Indian monarchs, etc. But these needed to be codified and buttressed by specific legislations. And a lot of it had occurred between 1857 and 1947. I refer to the Criminal Procedure Code, the Civil Procedure Code, the Evidence Act. Evidence Act, very important because the veracity and the weightage of statements made under oath is determined. And this was a tremendous intellectual challenge to the legislators of the day. So these are to name some of the contributions made to the legal system during that period. And also the idea that magistracy is a part of governance. The frame of reference here is probably as old as Plato. Remember Plato's philosopher magistrates. But the age of enlightenment in Europe also had a role in this. And which is why those of us who were trained to be administrators under that system had to be magistrates first. I say this because these principles have fed into the evolution of constitutional law in South Asia, and which has also flowed from rulings of various courts at various points in time. The recent 3-2 majority ruling on triple talaq in the Indian Supreme Court is a case in point. It struck down a practice that militated against, to my mind, the very sense of human justice and decency. The ruling brought India in line, by the way, with what has been in practice in the Muslim majority countries in South Asia, both in Pakistan and Bangladesh. And this has been the case ever since Field Marshal Ayub's Muslim Family Laws Ordinance in 1961. And that was over half a century ago. But the challenge in India will remain, by the way, its acceptance in the societal space. For that, this very positive judgment must be delinked from politics. I don't know if this will require legislation, but in any case, you cannot legislate human mindset. As all are aware, that justice must not only be done, but also seem to be done, and the courts must display a freedom from any political motivation. For instance, Mr. Modi might praise it because it helps in his base, as well as with the Muslim women. Mamata Banerjee, on the other hand, may remain silent for fear of slighting the Islamist support base in West Bengal. So these are to be expected. But there is always the fear that while justice may be blind, the justices may not always be so. Nevertheless, the ruling was a great step forward in terms of the spread of humane values. But my remarks mainly will deal with Pakistan, but will show that the challenge has not been very different there. I will cite a number of what we call case studies that have occurred over time and that have helped build Pakistan's judicial values in response to evolving challenges. Institution building is the essence of democratic governance, and judiciary is a primary institutional mechanism in the polity, a sine qua non of the prevalence of democratic principles, norms, and values. In Pakistan in 1953-54, the Governor General Ghulam Muhammad sacked the Prime Minister, Sir Khaja Nazimuddin, and dissolved the Constituent Assembly, which he disfavored, because the Assembly was just poised to adopt a resolution that would limit the powers of the Governor General. The then Speaker, Maulvi Tamizuddin Khan, went to the Sindh High Court. Those days, the capital was located in Karachi in Sindh. And Tamizuddin Khan obtained a favorable order. But he lost the case in the Supreme Court in a watershed judgment of Justice Munir. Now, Munir upheld, now this is the case law, the action of Governor General Ghulam Muhammad taken in the name of Elizabeth Regina by the grace of God, the Queen of Pakistan, was constitutionally in consonance with accepted practices in the Commonwealth. Justice Munir agreed with the argument of the State Council, Lord Diplock, that Pakistan did not actually become independent in 1947 and had the same status as other dominions. Munir drew from the Latin maxim, Salus Populi Suprema Lex, well-being of the people is the supreme law. And this concept was endorsed by philosophers, by English philosophers like Hobbes, Locke, and also Spinoza. But then he promulgated the principle of the so-called doctrine of necessity, based on the maxim that of a medieval jurist, I think his name was Henry Bracton, and the doctrine was that what is otherwise not lawful can be made lawful by necessity. Now the doctrine, the ramifications of Justice Munir's decision were to be felt across Pakistan's political, economic horizon, constitutional horizon, for across decades. This doctrine received a fillip in another judgment by him in 1958. That judgment, the 1958 judgment, uphold the proclamation of the first martial law in Pakistan by Ayub Khan. In a famous case entitled Dosso versus State, in 1958, Munir ruled that a peaceful revolution that has no overt opposition of the people is rendered legal. This was an extraordinarily significant ruling. What flowed rationally was that a successful coup d'etat was a legal method of changing governments and constitutions. The doctrine of necessity provided a framework of reference, by the way, in many Commonwealth countries, including Grenada and Nigeria and even Australia. As was to be expected, the principle was viewed as a justification of interventions in constitutional systemic organizations, and military interventions included. When in 2009, Chief Justice Iftekhar Chowdhury, I mean, it's not a very rare name among the grands in South Asia, he had a spat with the authorities and he issued what should have been an important ruling. Justice Chowdhury gave the opinion that no judge in Pakistan can support the acquisition of power in any manner by any unconstitutional functionary through modes other than as envisaged in the Constitution. And he further ruled that the doctrine of necessity had been buried forever. Alas, it is likely to be a very premature barrier. Those who argue that a modicum of judicial overreach was embedded in the court's decision in July this year to oust Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif would see the application of the principle in a morphed form. On an occasion earlier, the courts actually unseated another Prime Minister, said Yusuf Raza Gilani. In a contempt case in 2012, Gilani was sentenced to be held till the rising of the court, as sometimes happens, which barely lasted 30 seconds. However, the fallout lasted much longer. Gilani initially did not resign, and he was protected by the Speaker of the Parliament, who tried to shield him by an order, her order in which, by which she put the matter to rest. Eventually, it was the court which put the matter to rest, by the way, not only by retroactively disqualifying the Prime Minister, but also declaring all his decisions since the original court order null and void. The reverberations of the Nawaz Sharif decision was also felt in the politically faraway Bangladesh. To date, in Bangladesh, the government and the courts have had what is known as friendly relations. There is now, however, as some analysts believe, a palpable change. Earlier this month, on the 2nd of August 2017 to be precise, a full bench of the Supreme Court, is called the Appellate Court in Bangladesh, headed by Justice Surendra Kumar Sinha, unanimously scrapped the power of the Parliament and therefore the government to remove judges. The ruling overturned the 16th Amendment of the Constitution, which was actually adopted by over a 3/4 majority of the Parliament. And there is now, therefore, an uneasy relationship between the legislature and the executive in this very important phase leading up to the next elections in Bangladesh, 2018-19. Back to Pakistan. Chief Justice Khosa has praised the seamless democratic transition from Nawaz Sharif to Shahid Khan Abbasi. The courts obviously see themselves as arbiters of what is good for the people. But what is otherwise fair can become foul if the influence of any interested segment of the community becomes preponderant. And it includes the deep state or the man on horseback, otherwise the military. Legend has it that when the Christians were being severely persecuted in ancient Rome, their leader Peter had decided to flee Rome to save himself. And on the Appalachian way out of Rome, he suddenly beheld the apparition of Jesus walking in the opposite direction. And Peter fell on his knees. Domini quo vadis, he asked, O Lord, whither goest thou? And Jesus said, to Rome. I'm going to Rome to be crucified again. And Peter was inconsolably ashamed of his cowardice. He turned back, returned to Rome, took up the cudgels of faith, established the church, the fountainhead of Christianity, and as St. Peter became the first Pope and Bishop of Rome. I see Peter here as a metaphor for democracy in Pakistan. Rather than flee the unsavory circumstances, democracy in Pakistan should keep striving to restore itself. And given the commitment in these challenging times ahead, it should not, ought not, and cannot fail. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chowdhury. When Dr. Chowdhury started his speech, I thought his ethnic background would make him come up with more quotations from Shakespeare. But he disappointed us on that, but the speech excellent. Thank you. The next speaker is Shahid Javed Burki. He's an economist, been with the World Bank most of his life. One of his qualities that I find most valuable is his intimate knowledge of many of the players in Pakistan. And therefore, whatever he says has got a relevance that is on the ongoing politics of the country. With that, can I ask Dr. Chowdhury to, Mr. Burki, sorry, it takes a long time to share.
Share the name.
Well, from Dr. Chowdhury to Mr. Burki, it's quite a fall, my countrymen. Well, thank you very much, and delighted to be but participating in this workshop. When I was putting down some ideas as to what I should say, I found it a little bit difficult to understand the theme of this workshop, seminar, Pakistan in challenging times. What does it mean? Does it mean that the times are challenging not only for Pakistan but for the world at large? Or is Pakistan faced, in particular Pakistan, with challenges? If the latter, then my contention would be that Pakistan challenges became critical on August the 21st, when Donald Trump, the current president of the United States, talked about a new Afghan policy. And before that, my contention is that times were not particularly challenging for Pakistan if Pakistan is to be considered on its own and not as a part of the larger world. I have written on this subject. I published a book a few months ago in which I looked at the enormous changes that are taking place in the global system, in the global economy, in the way the world is organized. And that's a challenge not only for Pakistan. My view is that it's a challenge for the entire world, both developing and developed. And to a certain extent, a lot of this is happening because of the man who is currently leading the United States. But I won't go into that. It's a favorite subject of mine. We can have a chat after the workshop is over. But for Pakistan, the challenge became very critical when Trump came up with an approach in which I think very mistakenly, I would say, in a stupid way, he identified Pakistan as a challenge for his government, for the world's effort to stabilize Afghanistan. And my view is, and I talked about it the other day at Professor Mitra's meeting, that it's going to have enormously difficult, it's going to land Pakistan in enormously difficult circumstances. And it would affect not only Pakistan, but all of South Asia. My view about Pakistan, and I have written a longish paper on this, Pakistan at 70, is that this is a country which is extremely poorly understood. And my great friend Riaz, Hassan, pointed out some of the numbers which show that what Pakistan really is and what is the perception about Pakistan generally. Just to, by way of introducing this thought, I live in the United States and I have lots of American friends, and whenever I leave the US to go to Pakistan, some of them say to me, Javed, look after yourself. And I say to them, why do you keep saying this? And to one very good friend, I said to him, I said the probability of my being killed in a terrorist attack in Pakistan is infinitely smaller than my being killed in a car accident on New Jersey Turnpike. So his answer was very interesting. He said, that's probably true, but let me also say to you that if you are knocked down by a terrorist, the story and your picture will come on the front page of the New York Times, the Washington Post, and all other major newspapers. If you are killed in a New Jersey Turnpike, your wife will have to buy a little column of memoriam in order to observe your death. So that's the perception with which Pakistan is faced, and I think Riaz has some excellent numbers indicate where the country is. And I'll talk about, if I have the time, where the country could be going. But let me just make one point, and I was, this morning, I did some numbers and I'll give you some of those. The other day I was interviewed by a correspondent from a TV station in Singapore, and this was a program on 70 years of independence and so on. And he said to me, I'm going to ask you questions and please answer them. First question is, why Pakistan is such an economic disaster, and why has it failed in 70 years, whereas India has been such a success. So I said to him, you are talking nonsense. You have no idea what you're talking about. And he was taken aback by my very aggressive response. And in view of that, I thought it would be useful to give you some numbers of the change that has occurred in Pakistan. At the time of independence in 1947, Pakistan had a population of 32 million. Pakistan had a census a few months ago. It has not given out the numbers, but I think it's going to be around 200 million. So Pakistan's population is 6.25 times more now than it was the case in 1947. Now GDP estimated in 2017 dollars. At the time of independence, GDP was 12 billion. Today it is 300 billion, which means the GDP, the total value of services and goods produced by the country, is today 25 times larger than what it was 70 years ago. Now, if that is the case, which is the case, it cannot be called a failure. I think it's a tremendous success. GDP per capita was 375 at the time of partition. It is now 1,500. It is 4 times. Agriculture at the time of partition accounted for 75% of Pakistani economy. We should remember one thing, and Iftekhar was talking about the British period. When independence happened, the poorest part of the subcontinent became Pakistan. What became West Pakistan and what became East Pakistan were much, much poorer than what became India. And these were primarily agricultural economies. In 1947, 75% of Pakistan GDP came from the agriculture sector. Industry accounted for only 2% of GDP. If you read, and I have written some of Pakistan's economic history also, at the time of independence, Pakistan had 2 very small factories, one cement plant and one grain milling plant. That's it. That was the total industry. Now, Pakistan's industrial output is 72 billion, 300 times what it was in 1947. Pakistan's urban population in 1947 was only 1.5 billion, 4% of the total. Now it is estimated to be, and we'll find out when the results are out, 50%, 150 million. In other words, people living in the urban areas are now 100 times as many as people, as was the case in 1947. Take 2 cities, Lahore and Karachi. Their combined population in 1947 was less than 1 million. Today it is 35 million. So it's 40 times as much. And very interesting number is the incidence of poverty. In 1947, 70% of what is today Pakistan, and the figure was higher for what is today Bangladesh, 70% of the people lived in poverty. Today it is 18% according to the World Bank. So these numbers don't suggest that the country has failed economically. In fact, it has been mighty success. If you look at India's rate of growth, whereas Pakistan GDP over the 70-year period grew at about 4.6% a year, India grew at about 4.4% a year. So it was a slightly lower over the 70-year period. India has done much better than Pakistan in the last couple of decades, but not before that. The point I'm making is that the narrative of Pakistan is such an unfortunate one that it is affecting the flow of capital into the country. Now, as an economist, I know how important confidence is as an element in promoting development. People invest if they are confident about what's going to happen to the money that they're putting in. And when you have this kind of narrative about Pakistan, that it's an economic failure, that it is a country overtaken by terrorism, extremism, and so on and so forth, money doesn't come into the economy. In fact, as we know from Nawaz Sharif's case, even the leaders are not prepared to invest in their own country, and they rather buy houses in fashionable areas of London and so on. Now, what about the future? And this is where I begin to worry a lot about what Trump has done a few days ago. By singling out Pakistan as a country that is promoting terrorism, instability, and so on, he is putting Pakistan in a box. He's putting Pakistan in a corner. And the reaction to that may not be a very happy one. Chairman Pillai said, I know lots of very senior people and so on. One of those persons is Ashraf Ghani, the current president of Afghanistan. Ashraf used to work for me when I was at the World Bank. And he invited me some months ago to visit him in Kabul, and I did. And I sat down with him for a conversation that lasted for several hours, just one-on-one, after which I became very tired because I saw his own situation, which is precarious, but also not full understanding of what is happening in his country, what's going on, and so on. And he was, to me, blaming a lot of what's happening in his country on Pakistan. And I kept on telling him that, wake up. You have to do a lot yourself rather than blame people all over the world. His story, unfortunately, has been bought by Trump, and it has become a part of Trump's approach to the Afghan situation. What Trump is trying to do, I think, will have three consequences. And these will be very unfortunate, not only for Pakistan, but also for the rest of South Asia. First, I think he will probably have Pakistan give up the idea that they are going to beat back some terrorist groups and try and eliminate them. The most obvious one that the Americans are very afraid of and are putting pressure on Pakistan to get rid of is the Haqqani group. Ashraf Ghani said to me that Pakistan, by operating on its side of the border to get rid of extremists, and these are his words, that Pakistanis are pushing all the filth from their tribal areas into my country. And I said, well, when the filth arrives, you should do something about that. And he said, no, we don't have the power to do it. And the message you should be giving to the Pakistanis when you go home is that they should kill them all and not push them into Pakistan. That was his. My fear is that I have no idea. I've not talked to anybody in Pakistan about this. I'm just guessing. My fear is that Pakistan may decide that it's an American problem, it's an Afghan problem. We have pushed these people out. Let them do whatever they want in Afghanistan. And thereby, they could create a kind of a sliver of territory which will become quasi-independent from Afghanistan. Riaz Hassan points out very correctly, not many people know this, that there are 45 million Pakhtuns in the world, of which about 14 million are in Afghanistan, and I still have 5 minutes to go. I thought I was done. And around 25 million are in Pakistan. So Pakistan has a larger proportion of total Pakhtun population living in Pakistan. And if what I am saying might happen, that this Haqqani group may create a kind of autonomous Afghan territory, it will have consequences for Pakistan. Karachi, not many people know this. Karachi is the largest Pakhtun city in the world. There are about 5 million Pakhtun living in Karachi, and they've gone there in order to escape violence in their own country and so on. So that's one consequence. Second is, if this leads to enormous amount of resentment in Pakistan, it will have consequences in terms of pushing Pakistan even further towards China. Now, I know China very well. When I was at the World Bank, I worked on China for 7 years, and I got to know some of their senior leaders. And it was their desire to break out of isolation of their western part by using corridors through Pakistan and Kazakhstan. And that's what they're doing with CPEC. China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is a part of this. In fact, once Prime Minister of China, after I met with him, took me to his room and he said to me, "Look at my map." And I looked at the map and he said, "Do you find something strange about this?" And I had no idea what he was talking about. So I asked him, I said, "Tell me." He said, "We are landlocked on 3 sides. We are the only large country that is landlocked on 3 sides. India is not, United States is not, Canada is not, Russia is not, and so on and so forth. And we want to break out of this isolation, and we want to build a corridor through Pakistan. The Pakistanis are not taking any interest in this. So if you know anybody senior in Pakistan, could you give them this message?" So I did, and that's 25 years ago. So they've been at this for that long. And I think what the Americans have done now is to close Pakistan from being attended to by the Americans and by the West. And they have really moved Pakistan further into a corridor that would be managed and committed to, managed by China and committed to Chinese welfare and so on. And the third is Pakistan. In fact, I've done a little book with another person in which our message is that at this point, America needs Pakistan more than Pakistan needs America, because Pakistan has other avenues, China and so on and so forth, from which it can feed itself. And this would further, Trump's approach will further alienate people of Pakistan. If you, Riaz does this a lot. He looks at Pew Research surveys, and Pew is an organization that does surveys all over the world, and they have concluded that the United States is the least liked country in Pakistan. And the Americans return the compliment. Pakistan is the least liked country in the United States. So when you have this kind of thing, it's going to be very difficult for Pakistan to follow a course that would be good for the West, good for its own people, and perhaps result in bringing extremism even more prominently into the life of the country than has been the case up until now. So I'll stop here.
Thank you, Burki. The next speaker, when we were organizing the program and Jordan sent me the program, there were 3 illustrious speakers, but they were all Muslims. Sorry to be going into religion. So I decided there should be someone who's a non-Muslim, but a prolific writer on Middle East and on Islam. So I suggested Dr. Dorsey, who is actually from Rajaratnam school. So we managed to get him, and so the next speaker will be Dr. Dorsey.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. You've given me the unenviable task of following in the footsteps of the three preceding illustrious presentations. Let me start off facetiously. If I were to answer the question of what the security challenges are that Pakistan faces, the one-liner would be, where do I start? Where I would start is to look at structural issues that underlie the multiple dangers Pakistan confronts. What that does is help Pakistan, as well as the various external powers involved in Pakistani security, understand drivers and formulate policies. It also lays bare some uncomfortable truths many Pakistanis prefer not to acknowledge. Jumping the gun a little bit, I would suggest that one thing is a look at Pakistan's structural issues does is to explain why U.S. policy has failed and why the course President Trump intends to chart will fail. I would, however, also argue that it predicts the failure of the approach of China, that twice in the past week has expressed support for Pakistani rejection of U.S. concerns. The most immediate uncomfortable truth is that it is virtually impossible to separate Pakistan's domestic security concerns from its external ones. Not because they can be dismissed as a result of foreign interference, but because they are the legacy of past policies. Pakistanis with good reason point to U.S. and Saudi policies dating back to the war against the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, if not earlier. That is beyond doubt correct. It, however, is also an argument that conveniently allows its proponents to distract from the fact that Pakistan was and is a full partner in the execution of those policies, not simply either the victim or the poorly acknowledged facilitator. With other words, Pakistan is and was the ultimate arbitrator of its history and shares equal responsibility for the consequences of its decisions. Similarly, there is no doubt that Pakistan is located in a volatile part of the world. It shares borders with Afghanistan, that has been in the throes of war and insurgency for decades, Iran, and an increasingly nationalist India. It is a stone throw away from the Gulf, and is one of two regional nuclear powers. Having said that, I would argue that Pakistan's legitimate security concerns are as much a function of its geography as they are problems of its own making. There is equally no doubt that Pakistan has suffered significantly and continues to suffer from political violence. And indeed, Pakistan has done much to crack down on militant groups. The political divide emerges over the question whether the crackdown is comprehensive, targeting without qualification all militant groups, irrespective of who they are and what their goals are. I would argue that it doesn't. I would also argue that Pakistan, to its credit, as well as to its detriment, makes no bones about this. And I would further argue that this approach has become so deeply ingrained that it is difficult to reverse, will not be changed by U.S. sanctions, and ultimately will come to haunt Pakistan. Decades of Pakistani support for various groups in support of its approach to Kashmir, its filtering of much of the threat perception through the prism of challenges posed by India, concern about vulnerabilities that arise from ethnic unrest and neglect in Balochistan, and abetting and aiding of Saudi policies has created demons that lead their own life. To be sure, U.S. policy, including the prescriptions laid out by President Trump, do little to help Pakistan work through issues, take a step back, and look at alternative ways of enhancing domestic and external security. In fact, Trump's policies threaten to harden existing differences and exacerbate regional tensions. In short, one is likely to see much of the same, even if in some cases indications are that Pakistan is adopting innovative approaches. One such approach is evident in the case of Jamaat-ud-Dawa, a group that is widely viewed as a front for Lashkar-e-Taiba, a globally designated organization and led by Hafiz Saeed, who has been designated a terrorist under international law by the United Nations. For much of the past year, Saeed has been under house arrest rather than in prison. Jamaat-ud-Dawa has been allowed to continue operations. Treating Jamaat-ud-Dawa with kid gloves is but one issue that has raised questions about the sincerity and comprehensiveness of the Pakistani crackdown. Yet, a decision by the group to create a political party has sparked debate about how to deal with militancy in Pakistan. Indeed, a successful transition towards pluralistic political engagement that involves an absolute rejection of violence would significantly contribute to enhancing domestic security and could serve as a model for others. The chances of Jamaat-ud-Dawa becoming a model case, however, are undermined by the fact that there is little indication that its transition is embedded in broader policies. There is also little indication that Pakistan has the political will to reshape the environment in which at least tacitly militancy is allowed to flourish. Decades of Pakistani and Saudi support of various strands of Sunni Muslim ultra-conservatism has woven that worldview into the fabric of significant segments of government, the military, and society. It is a worldview that does not encourage pluralism, tolerance, and competitive political engagement. I grant you that it is easy to look in from the outside and be critical. I also think that tackling legacies is easier said than done. It is easy to criticize the U.S. for invading Afghanistan in 2001 and having been engaged in a war ever since that has only served to exacerbate threats to regional and Pakistani security, and that the United States ultimately cannot win. The problem is one has to deal with the cards one is dealt. Without going into great depth, I would argue that the U.S. in 2001 had no choice in Afghanistan, in contrast to the invasion of Iraq 2 years later. I was opposed to the intervention in the first 3 weeks of the war. I felt that diplomatic engagement with the Taliban was the preferred route. What changed my view was the discovery that U.S. and Taliban officials had been secretly meeting in various world capitals ever since the 1998 attacks on the U.S. embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam. The negotiations were going nowhere. 9/11, in my mind, left the U.S. with no choice. The result is a poorly executed war and, at best, half-hearted attempts to rebuild Afghanistan, a sine qua non for creating the economic, social, and political conditions to put an end to the violence. Multiple proxy wars, including the one between Pakistan and India, have only contributed to a situation that progressively deteriorates. None of this detracts from Pakistan's inability to project the image of a state that has zero tolerance for political violence and is selective in its confrontation of militancy. Doubts about the comprehensiveness of the Pakistani approach are fed by multiple factors, ranging from the lack of political will to seriously tackle educational reform, to failing to even project an image of a state that at the very least goes through the motions of confronting all militancy, to turning a blind eye when it suits the state's purpose. The risks are huge and could threaten what Pakistan sees as a lifeline, its all-weather friendship with China and China's multi-billion-dollar investment in the China-Pakistan economic corridor. Reports that Saudi Arabia and Iran are about to exchange diplomatic visits justify a degree of optimism that the kingdom may, at least for now, shelve plans to use Balochistan as a spring plank for efforts to destabilize Iran. The reports are bolstered by leaked emails that quote Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman as saying that he would favor U.S. engagement with Iran. Time will tell. There is much that calls into question how serious talk of reduced tension between Saudi Arabia and Iran is, something Pakistani security would greatly benefit from. Nonetheless, Pakistan policy in dealing with the potential threat of the Saudi-Iranian rivalry playing out in a crucial but already troubled province raises similar doubts For much of the past year, Pakistan has turned a blind eye to the flow of Saudi funds to militants, some of whom are associated with outlawed groups such as the successors of Sipah-e-Sabah and madrasas in Balochistan that nurture violent anti-Iranian, anti-Shia groups. The funds are often channeled through some Saudis of Balochi descent. Pakistan's response to the U.S. Treasury's designation in May of Maulana Ali Muhammad Abu Turab as a specially designated terrorist is a case in point. The response highlighted the murky world of Pakistani militancy, in which the lines between various groups are fluid, links to government are evident, and battles in Pakistan and Afghanistan, and potentially Iran, are interlinked. To be sure, the U.S. Treasury's designation is not legally binding on Pakistan. Nonetheless, Pakistan would have gained much from being seen to take note of the designation and publicly looking into the Treasury's allegations. It did nothing of the kind, putting out at best a meek statement. Abu Turab is a prominent Pakistani Islamic scholar of Afghan descent who serves on a government-appointed religious board, the Council of Islamic Ideology, maintains close ties to Saudi Arabia, runs a string of madrasas attended by thousands of students along Balochistan's border with Afghanistan, and is a major fundraiser for militant groups. A leader of Ahl al-Hadith, a Saudi-supported Pakistani Wahhabi group, a board member of Pakistan's Saudi-backed Tehran TV, and head of the Saudi-funded movement for the protection of the two holy cities, Abu Turab was designated on the very day he was fundraising in the kingdom. The Treasury described Abu Turab as a facilitator who helped raise money in the Gulf and support the movement of thousands of dollars from the Gulf to Pakistan. The Treasury sent funds raised by Abu Turab financed operations of various groups, including Jamaat al-Dawah, Lashkar-e-Taiba, the Taliban, and the Islamic State's South Asian Wing. A suspension of Abu Turab's membership in the Council of Islamic Ideology, pending the outcome of an independent Pakistani investigation, would have done much to enhance Pakistan's credibility. The failure to do so says much about the structural problems that underlie Pakistan's security dilemmas. So does the curious case of Masood Azhar, whose group Jaish al-Mohammed has been proscribed by the United Nations as well as Pakistan. It raises questions about China's approach that, frankly, I am at a loss to explain. China, at the behest of Pakistan, has for the second time this year prevented the United Nations from listing Azhar as a globally designated terrorist. It strikes me that various justifications put forward, including China honoring a request by the Pakistani military or seeing Azhar as a way to needle India, do not cut ice, given the threat militancy in Pakistan poses to China's vast interests in the country. In the short term, Pakistan, which has rejected Trump's allegations of Pakistani support for militancy as scapegoating, is likely to see its escape route as closer relations with China and perhaps Russia. Ultimately, however, Pakistan's relationship to militancy is likely to also complicate its ties to Beijing and Moscow amid escalating violence in Balochistan and no end in sight to the militant insurgency in Afghanistan. As a result, Pakistan's refusal to confront its demons could, in the final analysis, leave it out in the cold. Its relationship with the United States severely damaged, India strengthened by closer cooperation with the U.S., and China and Russia demanding that it do what Washington wanted in the first place. Pakistan is likely to have fewer, if any, options and no escape routes once China and Russia come to the conclusion Trump has already articulated. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard 4 excellent speakers. The organizers, Hernick and Jordan, when they were putting this program together, had offered me 3 to 5 minutes to say something. They, of course, assumed that I would do that as an opening remark, but you would have noticed that I did not. I decided that whatever I want to say, I'll say at the end, to preface a question that I have in mind, which has been troubling. I'm fairly familiar with South Asia, including Pakistan. I started doing business. I am familiar as a business person rather than as the scholars who are with me today. I started with the countries, or maybe 4 countries. Bangladesh, we set up, I was at that time general manager of a trading corporation owned substantially by the government. We set up a garment factory. We tried for some time. In Sri Lanka, we were looking to establish a palm oil estate because we were in palm oil trading. In Pakistan, we did thriving business in trading, particularly palm oil. In India, almost zero, nothing much done. Because India banned palm oil from Singapore because they said this is not being produced by you, so you cannot, because your traders have been playing parts with it, stearin and olein being mixed and sort of thing. I had to point out to them they buy a substantial quantity from Amsterdam, and Holland doesn't produce any palm oil. But there were enough very learned people, very sharp civil servants who will come in and tell you that that also is not wrong, right. Anyway, the point I'm making was, of all the 4 countries, to me, Pakistan was the most attractive. Nice place to go to, good food, good music, and generally very liberal. And I really enjoyed. So I had told myself that at a time when I have the means to invest, I would invest in Pakistan. That's my first choice. Because Bangladesh, while we had a thriving period, we had a problem later. The workers' strike and all sorts of rubbish, and we had to close the factory. Sri Lanka, we never got off the palm oil estate because the minister who was in charge was assassinated. He was also trying to introduce cricket into Sri Lanka, which he succeeded, but he didn't help us with the palm oil estate. So Pakistan was the one shiny. But over the years, from being a business person, I became ambassador to Pakistan as well as Iran. And between the two, I saw more potential in Iran for various reasons. But Pakistan, my experience was that it began to deteriorate. So this brings me to my question, which I want to pose to the 4 speakers. When Jinnah conceived Pakistan, he had in mind a Pakistan that was liberal, all religions had equal status, and it was where people could be free and democracy will be practiced. Just now, Professor Riaz Hassan, in his speech, final words, what will help things to improve? He said, openness. This is what is missing, I think. So my question is, what went wrong? Why is that with the death of Mr. Jinnah, the concept of Pakistan underwent a total change, and you have Pakistan today, which is being, rightly or wrongly being accused of every sin in the world. Everything that goes wrong, even the Chinese are, as Mr. Dorsey said, cautious that Xinjiang will not be populated by militants from Pakistan. So what was the reason why the dream of Jinnah was not realized? So may I start with volunteers, otherwise I'll have to volunteer them myself.
How long do I have?
He has given me up to 4:55.
I think,
But not all for you.
Mr. Chairman, this is I was 10 years old when we moved from the East Punjab to West Punjab. And I have had the good fortune to observe Pakistan both from inside and outside. And perhaps my greatest credential would be that I'm a sociologist and I was fortunate to use some of my analytical skills. They are not perfect. Sociology is not rocket science. But I think let me just begin by at least offering you skeletons of some answers, some bits of answers. Pakistan was established in a territory which has 4 provinces, 4 sections: Bangladesh, Balochistan, Punjab, Sindh, and the frontier province. I don't know how many of you will right or recognize. 4 of the 5 provinces were divided between 2 countries. Punjab between India and Pakistan, Balochistan between Iran and Pakistan, and frontier province between Afghanistan and Pakistan, and then of course what is now Bangladesh, again at East Bengal and West Bengal. And the fundamental, perhaps, assumption that Pakistani leaders made, that Islam would unite all of them. That was a very short-sighted view. Islam has never, in its history, united people. Maybe it has, from time to time, brought people together. If Islam could have united, Arabs would be the first one to be united. And they had 14 years of history, they had 17 countries. So religion, really, no religion can work as a uniting force. But what I think was missing in Pakistan's formation is the vision of the Pakistani leaders that they have to take into account ethnic, linguistic, and regional realities of the people. There are only 2 things that move history more than anything else. One is geography, and the other one is demography. Pakistan inherited a geography which was very complicated, and I think a number of people have pointed it out. Pakistan inherited a political vision which was deeply flawed, and I think the first casualty of that was Bangladesh. Not casualty, but first Bangladesh. And now Pakistan is actually beginning to, even now, I think Pakistani leaders do not realize this. But if you look at the political makeup, political parties, you still think they're primarily ethnic parties. Muslim League in Punjab, the Pashtuns have their own, there's more, the PTI, and then NQM, and Sindh has PPP. Of course, there is no really national party in Pakistan. India, on the other hand, muddled through by recognizing the diversity, linguistic and ethnic diversity, started with 14 states and has ended up at 28 or 29 states. So I think one reason why, and secondly, the Pakistan, Islam, because it was assumed that this paradigm is going to be the fundamental, and I think even people in Pakistan and Pakistani Muslims, I've studied Pakistani Muslims, they are very devoted to their religion, but they're very confused about it. I mean, if you ask them, have you read do you think Sharia law should be introduced? Of course. Have you read the Sharia law? No, only half of them have not read. So in a way, one has to start with the reality of the grounds. And I think perhaps the absence of knowledge, certainly Jalal is very wise, and a number of other people extremely well. I can't comment on them, other people, but to give you fragments of an answer, is that Pakistan's creation, geographical creation, was very problematic. Pakistan's political approach to build one country was deeply flawed, and I think over a period of time that has actually laid out and created conditions which you have just alluded to.
Mr. Burki has volunteered. He really did.
very difficult question to answer, but I'll be reasonably brief in giving, I guess, simple answers. The first is what I always call the paradox of Pakistan. Pakistan was created in the part of British India. What is Pakistan today? Which did not want Pakistan. Punjab didn't want Pakistan. The frontier province, what it was called, didn't want Pakistan. Pakistan was the result of a mass movement in what is today Bangladesh. And without that support that Fazlul Haq and his people gave Jinnah, Pakistan would not have come into being. So that's a paradox about Pakistan. The second is that Riaz talks about geography and demography as destiny. Jinnah certainly not, and I don't think many people around here expected that there will be a mass movement of population following partition. 8 million Indian Muslims or Muslims from India came into Pakistan, and 6 million Hindus and Sikhs went in the opposite direction. From 65% Muslim, 35% non-Muslim, Pakistan became 95% Muslim and 5% non-Muslim within a matter of months. Now, with that kind of religious transformation, it was, I think, inevitable that Islam will begin to play a greater role. And then the Saudis came along. And Saudis came along because, again, of another migration. Something like 4 to 5 million lower class people went from Pakistan to Saudi Arabia. These were unmarried young men who had nothing to do after their work was done but to go to mosques. And there they were indoctrinated. They came back and they brought Wahhabi Islam to Pakistan, whereas Pakistan was really a Sufistic country with a very liberal background. Just to give you some indication of what Pakistan was when I was growing up, when I joined the civil service of Pakistan, there were 3 things that you were required to do in addition to academic work: horseback riding, swimming, and tennis. The 4th was optional, but it was paid for by the state, and that was ballroom dancing. And I learned waltz and foxtrot because of this. When I tell this story to people in Pakistan, they don't believe it. That's what Pakistan was. So a mixture of combination, no mass movement or mass desire to create a Muslim country in what became Pakistan, then this massive transfer of population, and finally the Saudi influence of the country has been a disaster for Pakistan.
Mr. Chairman, may I just simply add, the civil service of Pakistan has been both a credit and an absolute disaster for Pakistan.
Although we can outdance you anytime.
However, on the civil service again, there was an MP called Farida who said that all that the Lahore Academy does, this is where we were trained, is to produce this bunch of very educated young men, because those days there were no women, who know how to mix their drinks well, execute beautiful bows to ladies and say, how do you do? Anyway, more seriously, Chairman, in response to your question, you see, Pakistan for Jinnah was his second best option. You see, Jinnah was, of course, Pakistan's king, emperor, archbishop of Canterbury, speaker, prime minister, all wrote into a formidable Qaid-e-Azam. But he didn't want Pakistan initially. Because you would have been quite happy, though Pakistan resolution was adopted in 1940, and largely because of the politics of Bengal and Calcutta. But you see, when the cabinet mission plan came to India, 44 was it? 46. The cabinet mission suggested a threefold division of India: Hindu majority states, Muslim majority states, and Bengal and Assam. Okay. Now, then the Congress rejected it So Pakistan was the other option, and as Mr. Burki has said, none of the states that constituted Pakistan actually wanted it, and it got half of Bengal also. But Bengal was still the most liberal component politically of Pakistani system. And it was the first state in Pakistan, province as it was called, which rejected even the Muslim League because they thought the Muslim League was passé. In 1954, Muslim League was voted out of government in Bengal. But after Bengal left, you see, Pakistan, the rest of Pakistan or whatever it was, had no other concern really with the rest of South Asia, except for Kashmir. If Kashmir were not to exist, then Pakistan would have turned westward. And there was an idea in 1971-72 that Pakistan will no longer be a South Asian country because it would be a Middle Eastern country. It was a West Asian country or Middle Eastern, or it was more an extension of Afghanistan than. So that was the problem. Pakistan's initial problem was the identity. What constitutes Pakistan? There was not even a common language because Urdu, which is today the language of Pakistan, was actually spoken more in Bengal than in Pakistan. You see, because Urdu is not the language of any of the Pakistanis. So after 71 also there was nothing to hold Pakistan together except Islam, of course. But then what happened is that all the independent countries of South Asia got linked to the international politics as well. And then Afghanistan happened. And there was a tremendous impact of what happened in Afghanistan in the 70s in the evolution of militancy in Pakistan and religious extremism. So, in a way, Pakistan has been very unlucky. It was actually, as you very rightly said, it was initially conceived as a Westphalian, Western kind of nation state by Jinnah, even though it was the second best option for him. He didn't last very long. He died a year thereafter. And mind you, what I was saying in my remarks about the judiciary, it was not conceived then that these entities within India will be totally sovereign states in the way they are now. You see, as I said in 54, there was even a judgment that Pakistan was not an independent country. So, it is the fact that Pakistan didn't quite conform to the aspirations of the original founders. Secondly, the delinkage of Pakistan was an idea whose time had not come. The linkage of the Eastern Wing. And thirdly, the exposure to global politics has rendered Pakistan largely to what it is today.
I just want to very briefly add on to some of the things that are said. I think you have, from the outset in Pakistan, a very complex relationship between religion and state. And it's a relationship. So you have a very complex, convoluted relationship between religion and state from the founding of Pakistan that still has not really been settled. I don't think that one can underestimate the role of Ziona and the policies that he pursued. And I think Mr. Burki is absolutely right on the expatriate labor that went to Saudi Arabia. But the Saudi role went far and beyond that. There was massive support for the deal boundaries, despite the ideological differences, and despite resistance initially by people like Abdullah bin Baz, the Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia. And that has had an enormous effect in terms of changing balances of power in segments of society and within branches of the state.
Thank you. Open it to the House. You have 25 minutes. The lady first.
Thank you. I have a question.
You may want to introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Sojin Shin from South Korea, working on India's political economy. I have a question to Dr. Dorsey and Mr. Burki about Pakistan's situation in the foreign aid. As far as I know, foreign aid has been a very important financial resource for Pakistan in many industrial sectors, plus national security. And the Pakistan is improving economic performance for the past many years. But a few days ago, I think the American Trump's administration announced that the U.S. will cut the budget for Pakistan, the foreign aid to Pakistan. And if you look at the data, the U.S. has been the biggest source for Pakistan's foreign aid. So how could you see the situations or scenarios that Pakistan government can opt in this situation?
Can we take two questions together? Deepinder?
Thank you. My name is Gopinath. I'm with the Institute of South Asian Studies. Yeah, make a brief comment and then follow up with the question.
Yes, as brief as possible.
Well, certainly. So I grew up, my parents are both from Punjab, and Lahore was the center of the universe, place where music, art, poetry flourished. So as you pointed out, as Burki pointed out, the strain of Islam that prevailed throughout Kashmir, North India, and now Pakistan, was primarily of a liberal Sufis bent. The changes were brought about with the introduction and the inflow of funds from Saudi Arabia, the Salafist and the Wahhabi influence, and that got accentuated during President Ziaul Haq's tenure in particular. My question pertains to what is it that made Pakistan a receptive, a fertile ground for absorbing and so much of the local ethos changing into something which was utterly alien. So one thesis that's put forward is the separation of Bangladesh, where the anchor shifted completely from a South Asian, more liberal ethos, further towards West, a more reduction, almost bypassing Iran, which bears, again, a very rich cultural heritage, legacy. So one of the contentions is that, again, the role of the elites in Pakistan, that education and health were completely marginalized, leaving a large proportion of youth with little prospects. And there are parallels in India, of course, which you see in the rise of naturalism and other violent movements. Is this, coupled with the role of Mr. Ziaul Haq for strategic reasons and the marginalization of the relative disenfranchised, would you agree with the contention that this is what provided a fertile breeding ground for the extreme right to come up? And is there a way out of this logjam? Because there's not much that suggests that the elite, those in power, are going to be progressive, open enough to take on the bold reforms that are needed to give people on the margin some hope for the future, hope in life. Thank you.
Maybe we take the first question.
Yeah, if I could, or you want to do it first, I'd like to answer the second question also.
Yes, we'll come to
Okay.
That's an easy one to answer. The easy answer is that Pakistan is not anymore dependent on foreign assistance as much as it was in the 60s and early 70s. And the reason for that is remittances. Pakistan has one of the largest expatriate population these days in the world if you look at it in terms of proportion of the people who are living outside. About 10 million Pakistanis, 5% of the population is outside the country. And I've done some calculation somewhere. Some of them are extremely well-to-do, particularly in the United States and so on. And they're sending a lot of money to Pakistan. Yasin would know better because he was a banker in the United States and Britain. Something like 10 billion officially comes into Pakistan as remittances, and informally there's an even much larger flow. So foreign assistance does not play the kind of role that it did in the 60s and early 70s. Insofar as your question is concerned, blaming Zia is a bit of a cop-out. A lot of stuff that went wrong with Pakistan started with Bhutto. Bhutto banned Ahmadis, declared them to be a minority, and for people such as Ifti and myself, he banned alcohol.
And we are being honest now.
So he started it all, and he was such, I mean, the man was a peculiar fellow. He did all this without believing in it. It is the Saudis, I'm saying, blaming Zia is a cop-out, because it is the Saudis that have done this to Pakistan. And Zia could do it because of the Saudi influence had already turned a very significant proportion of the population towards very difficult type of Islam. I'm looking for the right word. And that's because of Saudi. So let's not blame Zia, because Zia did it. Zia did a lot of damage to the country, but he could do it because the Saudi influence had already begun to have an impact.
James, would you?
Yeah, if I can just add on to what you said in response to the first question. I don't think that, first of all, Pakistan is financially dependent on the U.S. The question is how much is militarily dependent on the U.S. The Chinese were coming out this morning saying that 60% of their arms sales today are going to Pakistan. So, frankly, I don't think the Americans have the leverage, leaving aside the merits of the policy as such. On the second issue, you're absolutely right about Pluto. There are two things, and also in response to what you were saying. One is, yes, you can blame the Saudis. I've not shied away from doing so over a long period of time, but it wouldn't have happened without the Pakistani nuclear question. You know, and I think one has to state that very clearly. I would disagree with you that this is about an interpretation of the faith that is alien. For two reasons. One is the perception of Saudi funds used is that it's for the promotion of Wahhabism. It is not. And if you look at a world in which the Saudis have pumped roughly $100 billion over 4 decades, the Wahhabi community is minuscule. The Sunni ultra-Muslim community, whatever strand of faith that may be, is significant. That's where the money went into. And that includes the Deobandis, who are a Sunni ultra-conservative movement. And sure, there are differences with Wahhabism, but there's a lot in common too. So I don't think you're talking about an ideology or an interpretation of the faith, if you want. That is alien. You also have the problem that the influence of this, of whatever strand of ultra-conservatism, some of it, by the way, very innovative in its own way. This is not just purely the retreat to the Stone Age. Some of it is seriously innovative. Is very widespread among the Pakistani youth. And, you know, you just look at the influence of the power of groups like Al-Huda and similar organizations built over a number of years. You know, they've turned what was a more open-minded, liberal segment of the society into a very conservative, inward-looking segment of the society, or at least significant segments of it.
Thank you. Yeah, very, very quickly, your point about foreign aid to Pakistan is also relevant to countries like Bangladesh. You see, the dependence on foreign aid is now, as in Pakistan, for most of our countries, is very little. I mean, say my own country is 11% per year annual this thing, 8% credit from World Bank, Asian Development Bank, 2% European Union, and 1% Japan. The United States is not even a major donor in Bangladesh, less so in Pakistan. James is absolutely right. It is in the military context where it becomes significant. Also, let me just flag another point: the changing nature of the Pakistani elite. I mean, that was when, as Javed said, we were the elite, but that's gone. That's per se. Then came. There is an agricultural elite in Pakistan, which is also represented by the feudals, the Chaudhurys khans, etc. And then there is the military elite, up and coming, the officers representing the meritocracy, and a changing nature of the military itself, because the military is being represented by the peasantry from the villages who are increasingly becoming a little more Islamicized. General Karamat is coming on the 11th, and he will tell you that the army in Pakistan actually represents the mirror, is the mirror image of what is there in the country. And it's true not just of Pakistan, it's also true of some of our countries. As to the sort of extremicization, if you can call it, of Islam and Pakistan, Pakistan is not the only country, not very far from here, where we see the developers in Malaysia, we see the developers in Brunei. And so it's, to me, and I'm a diplomat, it's a global phenomenon, and we just caught up in it.
Yes. I think sorry, there is I don't have the benefit of some of the experiences that my distinguished colleagues have, but just as a sociologist, I think there is a small industry now which claim to have expertise on Islam in Pakistan, on Islam. Enormous number of books are written every day, you have newspaper articles, but let me make one observation. They are the people, most people who are commenting on Islam as part of this industry, they actually do not know. They have never lived in Pakistan, they don't experience, they have not lived the Pakistani Muslims. Pakistani Muslims are not what is portrayed. I mean, I go there, I see my brothers and sisters, and I see my relatives, I see my friends, and of course there is a shift, and I'll come to that. Now, if you want to know what Pakistan is saying, I'm sure, Mr. Chairman, you'll forgive me, read my book. Now, if you don't want to read the book, just read one essay by Iftekhar Chowdhury. In 2002, just before he died, he wrote an essay in New York Review of Books, Which Way to Mecca. And just read the review of the books, and particularly my book in that. No, I'm not suggesting an uncovers party, but I think coming back to, yes, Saudi influence, but that always makes me feel that as people, Pakistani people are just empty vessels. Saudi money comes in and they say, oh my God, they want us to be like this. It's very much the view that people have of the Palestinian, people. Pakistanis are not unthinking people. They don't simply are persuaded by the money flowing in. Now, there is absolutely no question about it. The Saudi money and money from other countries have had some influence in building institutions, and I think a number of points that you have been made about the madrasas, and particularly after the American intervention in Afghanistan. But let me give you the fundamental reason what has happened to religion in Pakistan and globally, not only to Islam, to Christianity. The fundamental change that has happened in the world today, in the world of Islam. 50 years ago, majority of the Muslims could not read and write. Literacy was one of the highest in the Muslim world. Today, 60% of Muslims can read and write. They are literate. What happens when people become social reproduction, moves from literate reproduction to non-literate reproduction to literate reproduction? Read Jack Woody's work on literacy. Literacy is one of the most transformative influence on human mind. What happens when people become literate? They also become critical, they become cynical. And one of the fundamental changes that my work in Singapore, in Indonesia, and in Pakistan, various countries that obviously it didn't make any impression on you when I showed the figures, is that when people are more educated, they work, they live in the urban areas, and they work in modern sector of economies, they become more puritanical in their religious outlook. Now, that is the empirical evidence. Until such time you offer me another way. That is one reason why urban areas are much more Islamic than the rural areas, because people are more educated, people live in, work in modern sector of economy, and they have been longer residents. So I think to simply, but to the point, literacy is one of the most fundamental change that has occurred in the Muslim world, including Pakistan, because Pakistan was very backward. And that change has actually brought about religious revival and religious change. And I think it will, how long it will go on, I'm not sure, but I just want to point out that it's not simply money coming in, because Pakistanis and Muslims are not empty vessels where they can say, okay, well, I'm going to change it, because there are other changes which are taking place in societies in which they live, which are actually having much greater influence on Islam and on their religious consciousness.
One quick word.
One quick question to Professor Riaz. After having called the civil service, to which Ifti and I belong, an unmitigated disaster, why did you call us my distinguished colleagues?
You may not have heard it, but I say you were both the asset and the liability.
Okay, we have 3 questions now. Oh, 4. Anish first. We'll take them together because we have only 10 minutes.
Okay, my name is Anish Mishra. I'll just make this very, very fast. First, I want to start with a comment. The topic video was on challenges on Pakistan, and I think I was quite surprised why the #1 challenge of Pakistan has not been addressed at all, and that is electricity, energy. Energy today is actually the #1 crisis of Pakistan, and this has not been addressed today. Okay, coming to my question. My first question is on relations with the United States. Just a few days back, I'm sure everyone was familiar with Donald Trump's speech on the strategy of Afghanistan. But what happened on that day was not something that was, just has happened or just out of the blue. This has been a long process. You see, in the United States, there's a very strong Indian lobby there, and there's a very strong anti-Pakistan lobby going on. Mr. Burki, I'm sure you must be familiar with the remarks of Tekpo and Dana Robacher.
Try and keep it short. We've got 4 others.
Yes.
Yeah? Okay.
How
Give
can,
you 1 minute.
Okay. How can Pakistan repair its relations with the United States? And the second question, make it in a few seconds, is that the restoration of democracy is still a work in progress. So what else does this panel think needs to be done to actually fully restore democracy in Pakistan? Thank you.
Okay. Here. This gentleman here.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Ambassador.
As short as possible.
My name is Danish Sultan, and I'm a Marine person capacity. I'll ask the question first to Professor Riaz Hassan on your age pyramid. With time, you said there will be three generations sharing, and do you think that that will cause equal distribution of wealth between the generations when they are competing with each other for space? I heard a few comments about how Ziadat and everyone else was responsible. We completely forgot the Americans who funded the Mujahideen, who trained them, who funded the madrasas, who held the hand of the Saudis, and they were the ones who also trained Osama bin Laden. That's a comment. A question to Dr. Chowdhury here. You spoke about the courts and the courts taking decisions on the basis of necessity, and we have seen that in Pakistan. That's been done once too often. But would you prefer a court taking a decision of necessity compared to a military coup? Because it's called a coup in court, basically. So what would you prefer?
Thank you. The lady here.
Oh, I just had one slight observation. The panel here, Ambassador Gopinath, you mentioned why Pakistan did not go the way. So the question of illiteracy in Pakistan didn't come about as obvious. Democracy comes with literacy, and I just felt nobody kind of felt that the education and infrastructure could not quite stabilize or take off because of the lack of literacy. I felt that was I would have seen that as the biggest challenge next to the regional diversity that we had and the political. So for me, the literacy factor, it's still there. It's like knowing thing that goes on in Pakistan.
Thank you. Jesse?
Thank you. I just have a quick comment on the economy and then a quick question on politics. I'm fully in agreement with a banker also, so I'll comment on the economy a bit, that the narrative on Pakistan is absolutely very negative everywhere in the world. That's because the true story is never picked up, and Mr. Burki has mentioned a couple of points. One example it would be that Pakistan since inception has never defaulted on any repatriation of dividend payouts by the central bank at all times, even when the reserves are down to $100 million. Secondly, last year it was rated as the top MSCI index performer in the world, and still is performing well. Thirdly, I mentioned earlier about the foreign aid. There's a misrepresentation that has been made. In that the last several years there has been no U.S. foreign aid really coming in the sense that it's not gone into economic productive resources. The foreign aid that Mr. Trump mentioned is not really foreign aid. Is coalition support funds, reimbursement of that. And I used to collect those in the U.S. Treasury and State Department since 2010. And they went straight into the central bank, those numbers that he's quoting. They're reimbursement for the military expenditures that go towards fighting the terrorist war on behalf of the United States and all the expenditures that go on board. Now in that political question, it's a very simplistic one, and since I'm not on the politics side, is that Mr. Burki mentioned and Mr. Dorsey mentioned that the terrorism that is being tackled right now and the military force last year, the General Rahim Sharif, pushed these fellows out from that particular northern frontier area, much to the extent it was complimented by the United States and given a Legion of Merit for that effort. But they all went into Afghanistan. My question would be, why is it the U.S. troops, if they're increasing them, why don't they block that border and capture them or kill them? That's one. It's a very simple one, if they're pushed in. And secondly, why is it for the U.S. just declare the Honey Network a terrorist organization? They have not done that. That would be a very simple question. Why haven't they done that?
Okay. There was somebody at the back. Yes. I think this will be the last question, and the panel will take them together.
Thank you. My name is Adil. I've had the fortune of living in the US for a decade and in China for about a decade now here. My question is about Pakistan's relationship with China. Well, there's much to admire about both countries. Somebody mentioned the perception of Pakistan and the US is not particularly good. At least based on my observations living in China for a decade, outside of Beijing, there isn't a very positive perception of Pakistan and the rest of China either. It's considered to be a sort of client state, like North Korea. So how long is this relationship with China going to go on if there isn't a strong cultural sort of a synergy of values, so to speak?
Okay, can I start from you, Riaz? You've got a number of questions. I'm not going to summarize them because I can't remember them.
I think on the age pyramid, there's a standard, it's clearly established paradigm now that if you divide the age cohort into old age, middle age, and the young are the middle age has the most assets. They have the largest number of assets. And for example, in Australia, 60% of the assets are actually in the middle, between 20, 40, and 60. So as people grow older, they become asset rich and income poor. And young people are also income poor. So that actually reinforces that fundamental dynamics, which actually produces intergenerational conflict. The reason I wanted to mention that middle-aged people in Pakistan are going to increase very dramatically, as you can see. And they are going to be working, and they're going to have the resources, and they're going to be the gatekeepers of resources. As a result of that, the young people are going to be much more deprived at the moment because they don't have the numbers. So the middle age is not only richest in terms of assets, they control assets, and they are actually very important in distribution of assets in the society. And in particular, they are very important in terms of acting as barrier for mobility of young people, and that creates the conflict. So and that intergenerational conflict is not purely a figment of imagination. It has enormous implication for politics, for society, for people, for political movement, for radical movements, etc. I think I would probably, are there any other question that I was, yeah, that's it.
Let me make two very quick points on questions that were addressed to me. One is building a democracy. Building a democracy is always work in progress. It's like building a medieval Gothic cathedral. It never gets finished. You always keep on building, keep on changing. So this is a process that will be a continuous phenomenon. The other thing about institution building and preference, I of course have no preferences. What I seek to do is naturally to analyze things as I perceive as they exist. That's what I was doing. Yes, when institutions are built in Pakistan, like judiciary, army, bureaucracy, etc., even in the world's most sophisticated systems, you see, sometimes policy output is the result of pulls and pushes and conflicts and competition among these various institutions. Even analysts like Graham Allison have talked about America as being just bureaucratic politics. All these institutions vie for the ear of the decision makers, and what the decision output is by nature, by the mathematical nature of the output, is irrational. So, I mean, this is something that will go on, and we'll sort of have to live with it. But the best we can do is to channel it in a way that it is most positive in terms of the benefits of the peoples involved.
I just wanted to make Islamic radicalism and militancy is not Islam versus the other. It is fundamentally evolved within Islam. I think you have to recognize that. And I think I don't have the time, otherwise if we have time, that is really the driving force. It's Islam it's fight within Islam, and not against other religion or other people.
I'll be very brief, just to pick up on what Ifti was saying about democracy, work in progress. Even in the United States, it's a work in progress, which prides itself in having one of the most vibrant democratic systems. But Pakistan is one of the few countries in the Muslim world where progress is being made. And I think what the court did in throwing Nawaz Sharif out is a part of that positive process. Second, about China, how long would it last? I think the Chinese are into something that is not fully understood. They have a new development paradigm. They are going to build commercial relations on land-based commerce. Chinese know this, and this work was done by the Pentagon and the Russians before that. There's something like $2 trillion worth of mineral wealth exists in Central Asia, Afghanistan, and parts of Pakistan. And the Chinese are very keen to exploit this, and the only way you can make use of that is by building roads and corridors and so forth. So they are there for a very long time. And third, you were talking about education, and one thing very interesting about Pakistan, which not many people realize, is how well Pakistani women are doing compared to Pakistani men, who are doing very poorly. Pakistani women are terrific, Pakistani men are not.
Should I say I wonder why?
And something like 1 million highly trained women in Pakistan are entering the workforce. And they're going into modern sectors of the economy, finance, IT sector, entertainment, TV and so on, journalism. So women, there's a lot of hope Pakistan should have by getting women into the workforce.
Great.
James? Just the last word. Just a few brief remarks. Fundamentally, the issues of education, democracy, the Saudis are interlinked. And I would agree with Javed, absolutely, that the decision...
The first time he's agreed with me.
No, that's not quite true, but there are differences, granted. That the decision to oust, the way Nawaz Sharif was ousted is democratic. The problem is, this is not about simply democracy at the top. It's about attitudes. And the fundamentals of democratic attitudes in large swaths of Pakistan do not exist. In terms of tolerance, in terms of pluralism. And a lot of that, not exclusively, but a lot of that lies in the education. And when you go to the schools, when you go to the madrasas, you see it. In effect, you could argue that today the Saudis are not relevant. With other words, if you have pumped $100 billion, as I mentioned earlier, over 4 decades, you've created something that no longer is dependent on you. Part of it is going to turn on you, in fact. And it leads a life of its own. This is today a Pakistani problem, not a Saudi problem. And it's not as simple, it's not simply that the Saudis have money and therefore you're going to go follow them. Of course not. People are not that simple. But the processes in which people adopt a worldview that is inward-looking and intolerant and does not encourage a more democratic approach are certainly there. And they were stimulated by the Saudis, but today the Saudis are no longer the problem.
I will now hand it over to
look, I think if you look at Trump's speech, what do you mean? I like so well first. But if you look at Trump's South Asia speech, there's a clear distinction. We're going to eradicate the Islamic State. We're going to destroy Al-Qaeda. But there are elements of the Taliban we want to talk to. So there's a clear, again, I'm accusing the Pakistanis of not being comprehensive. The same accusation can be made towards the U.S., fair enough. But at the end of the day, what he was saying, and I'm the last person to defend him, but at the end of the day, what he was saying was the ultimate solution is a political process. And militants will have to be part of that process. I'm not sure that answers your question. Well, it's one vote of contention. And I don't know what the reason is.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I will now pass on to the MC to wind up the meeting.
Thank you, distinguished speakers. I would now like to invite Ambassador Gopinath Pillai to present a token of appreciation to our guest speaker, Dr. James Dorsey.
Wow. We'll be happy with cash.
Thank you, Ambassador Pillai. We have now come to the end of the ISAS panel discussion. We thank you for your participation and we hope to see you in future ISAS events. Have a good evening.
Tea reception. Better announce it.
The tea reception.